let's dive into why Unity 2020 is being considered such an important thought, because a lot of where we're going here with who formed it, with Bret Weinstein's work, we're going to get into a little bit more clearly later. Why is this important and relevant to understanding this plan? We'll see that there are some very key concepts to why it's being done this way instead of another way. So at the risk of stating the obvious, first of all, I'm assuming that if you're here, you have probably found this because you not just want to know about Unity 2020, but you want to know about Unity 2020 in order to know are there any alternatives to the current system. We have seen a terrible time with Trump, and we've been predicting a terrible time with Biden. So I'm not going to, although I really do feel strongly that you should be aware of the good points to both of these candidates as well to make a balanced decision and things, I'm actually only going to talk about not even the specific details of each candidate, but the scenarios that we are anticipating could go down on both their fronts, and that relies a little bit on past history, but it also has a lot to do with where we think things are going in the current socio-political sphere. So with Trump, I think it's fairly obvious, but if it's not, what I highly recommend checking out is this came out just a few days ago, Chris Wallace's interview with him. Chris Wallace is, of course, from Fox News Sunday, and his interview with Trump was very unsettling in some ways, and yet nothing particularly new. We saw him really hold Trump's feet to the fire, and in an attempt to get some basic questions answered, we could actually see the president relying on sources of information literally being handed them by his aides. Sources of information that are either, if not downright inaccurate, are missing key pieces of information that Wallace then tries to offer. He did a terrific job and really asked, I think, some of the right questions. Let's just touch on for a second some of the main issues we should be concerned about here with these two candidates. So Trump's environmental policy, as mentioned in, and I'm afraid not as big a follower anymore, but PBS did write a very insightful article on understanding President Trump on the issues for his current platform. Among them are his skepticism about climate change. Let's see if we can find that here. Yeah. So where President Trump stands on the issues in 2020, written just last month. So this will cover immigration, economy. In terms of environmental policy, skepticism, climate change, which he called a hoax before taking office and has continued to question as president. Of course, he has intended for a long time his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord and to boost fossil fuel development as much as possible. Also really important in the current atmosphere is this whole MAGA concept, which you might notice if you go to his new his current website is no longer MAGA, Make America Great Again. You'll notice it now is Keep America Great, which I think is controversial in itself, of course. But part of what people's main dislike of the MAGA creed is that has America been great before truly, in the sense that when we say Make America Great Again, what time period are we calling up in our imagination? This has never been completely true for all Americans. And so saying that we're going to make it great again tends to trigger for a lot of people ideas of economic policy and whatnot that are liable to take into account only the slim minority of particularly upper class or corporate CEOs and their shares of wealth. So as written in the same article by PBS, his administration has slashed regulations on the financial, agricultural, and energy sectors, among others, arguing that deregulation spurs economic growth. Manufacturing jobs have gone up under Trump, this is true, though there are signs the boom is slowing. The coal industry is no longer shedding jobs after years of decline under President Barack Obama. though it hasn't grown as more energy companies shift away from coal. So while the economy is doing well, his claims that the economy is the strongest or best in U.S. history are false. There's also a lot to be said for what particular sectors where these lies are pertaining to strongest. So unemployment rate, labor force, participation rates, and the GDP itself all have been currently debunked over and over again regarding the president's claims. Washington Post by Glenn Kessler came out September 2018, just as a refresher of that. Not sure when the last time is that you may have wanted to delve into Trump's presidency, past history and presidency. His track record, though, seems to indicate this pretty strongly. Quoting the article, the economy certainly is pretty strong right now with the unemployment rate low and stock market indices at record highs. Keep in mind, this is why people may still consider Trump even if they are not fully in alignment or in agreement with his policies. We will lay aside the issue of whether Trump can claim credit for the state of the economy because of his tax bill and deregulatory efforts, or whether he merely inherited a winning hand from President Barack Obama. Skipping a little bit, the president can certainly brag about the state of the economy, but he runs into trouble when he repeatedly makes a play for the history books. By just about any important measure, the economy today is not doing as well as it did under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Bill Clinton, and Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, so that's most of the economy stuff, but one last point on that. This whole move, too, that influences both economic measures and his voter turnout, quite honestly, is the issue of racism and white supremacy support, which would be blatantly apparent to most people, particularly when we look at things like the Charleston riots and so forth. So his take on, and many, of course, the racist slurs that we have witnessed him make over his presidency and prior to his presidency. So in those terms, we can say he's not looking good, and then foreign policy is debatable. This is the one place where I think it's worth giving Trump a little bit of credit. The relationship with China has been terse, it has been difficult, but that said, part of what the focus seems to have been has been to finally hold China responsible for a lot of the intellectual rights, leaking of intellectual rights and property by American workers and businesses to China, and in such ways that there is a major benefit in China for making these copyright infringements. That said, they are rarely charged for it would seem, but regardless, trying to hold them responsible has been one of his biggest platform pieces, and is what a lot of people have been considering of him. That said, we can't say that his foreign policy in general looks hot outside of that central thing. And of course, he's not really Republican, and we've all known that. He's something else, and it's something to bear in mind as we're considering the two candidates anyway. Biden is trickier for some people unless you buy into a lot of the hotter extreme right stances or news sound bites that are out there. I particularly recommend Crystal Ball from The Rising that we just spoke about on The Hill. Crystal Ball previewing the hellish future of a Biden administration. This was released April 2020. And just to be clear, Crystal Ball is not just a commenter. She was actually a Democratic Party nominee for Virginia's 1st Congressional District in 2010. So she is fairly aware of what politics looks like, especially in Virginia. So among the things she says there, she includes, even with Biden's vaunted middle-class Joe persona, he is on pace right now to perform even worse with the white working class in 2020 than Hillary Clinton did back in 2016, which we'll see if that's true. In other words, if Joe Biden becomes president, this is skipping down a little bit, it will be with the very same coalition and affinities as the Democratic Party in Virginia. As such, Virginia offers a dire warning for those of us who care about workers' rights and dignity. Cultural and tokenist issues rule the day as well. So, in other words, there is a lot that the DNC has done in Biden's nomination to and candidacy at this point, the platform, doing a very performative measure, committing to speaking, to paying lip service to a number of definite issues, real social issues that are occurring that we'll talk about at length here, particularly the racism, anti-racism issue. Trying to appeal to that audience in ways that don't necessarily demonstrate effective commitment to policy that will actually change the oppressive pieces of that system, whether you consider them oppressive or simply biased to begin with. She continues also, let me just say this one more time to make it totally clear. Virginia is run 100% by Democrats, and it remains dead last in the nation for issues of concern to working people. Absolutely shameful. So she feels very strongly we need to look at Virginia's Democratic Party and its stances and its recent actions to understand best what Joe Biden is about. And for further reference here, it would be worth taking a look at The Guardian by Zephyr Teachout, which actually is from earlier in Biden's candidacy here. Teachout is not anti-Biden. He's very pro-Biden. In fact, part of what I find distasteful about the article is that he wants to give a reason for... He's basically arguing why Biden is a weak candidate. So he's definitely, let me say, not pro-Biden necessarily, but he's very pro-Democrat. And at least in this article it would seem, and against Trump. But it doesn't seem to bother him very much what the absolute implications of the corruption he's speaking to are. But he does say it looks like middle-class Joe has perfected the art of taking big contributions and representing his corporate donors at the cost of middle and working-class Americans, converting campaign contributions into legislative favors and policy positions isn't being moderate. It is the kind of transactional politics Americans have come to loathe. And I think he's correctly speaking to that. Corporate, not just corporate, but corruption in general has been a major backlash from the public against the DNC. Both sides of the spectrum, actually, at this point. More on that in a second. Crystal Ball, just to make one more point from what she said. She says, I think that she thinks the New York Times, she mentions, appears to have ignored the way that Virginia Democrats have prolonged some pro-worker policies in order to focus on basically a red herring, focusing on the dismantling of the recent monuments and everything else that were all about the white supremacist measures and so forth. That this New York Times attempt to look away, or at least not address how those pro-worker policies, minimum wage problems, things like that are being overlooked, that it exposes the Times' party bias and also their targeted audience. So if you weren't sure, of course, and most of us have been, they are targeting a certain audience. So she says, I think that problem with the New York Times also helps to explain the does not compute disconnect between the Sanders left and the neoliberal establishment. They're like, look, you're going to get some progressive stuff, and we're like, yeah, but you're going to sell out to corporations, and working people are still going to get totally screwed, Virginia suburban style. The Virginia Democratic Party is the National Democratic Party now. So whether you agree with that or not, keep in mind, we're looking at perspectives here, and this is one of the perceptions that we are currently entertaining as we look closer at Biden's platform. Now, Biden, to his credit, is closer to center than Sanders. I am not anti-Sanders, by the way, but I can see a lot of the resistance against someone that would be that far to the left. However, some important other things to keep in mind besides the clear signs of, what may be clear signs of corruption, are his mental condition. And if we're thinking in terms of scenario and not just people, that is not just the candidate, but what are they ushering in, that mental condition could end up resulting in not him, but the vice president being one of the main figures, if not the main figure, that we are receiving in through the coming election. And there's a lot writing on this very same problem Crystal Ball is pointing out here, particularly the black vote in congruence with the anti-racism movement. There's a lot of what we can call tokenist efforts, whereby the party attempts to demonstrate, it's basically virtue signaling at a higher level. So a couple of examples where Biden has gotten into trouble around this virtue signaling stuff and perhaps either tipped his hand or perhaps simply made very bad slips of the tongue. One example of that was the not so long ago interview he had with Charlemagne the God on the Breakfast Club. So he tells Charlemagne the God, who wishes to take up more of Biden's time if possible because Biden has to go, but he really has some more questions that he wants his community, trying to get Biden to stay a little bit longer. Biden says, "I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black." So the Breakfast Club is a big deal. This is a hugely popular radio show, at least according to its own About page. And it is syndicated by premier networks on nearly 100 stations across the nation. So this is a very highly rated urban morning show that Biden was invited to be interviewed on. This doesn't seem to be just Biden. This seems to reflect a general attitude. Another case in point was that when Charlemagne the God, during another breakfast interview with 3 other hosts, he was interviewing Clinton, and I'll put this link in the description as well. In this video, you can hear Charlemagne the God after Hillary Clinton was asked what's in her purse, what does she like to carry in her purse all the time, just some icebreaker sort of thing, I suppose. Towards the end of the video, though, oddly, the interview, Hillary Clinton says hot sauce, and there is apparently a line in Beyonce's work somewhere about hot sauce and bag swag or something like that. Forgive me, I don't listen to a lot of more popular modern music, so I'm going to seem like quite the nerd around this, but Charlemagne the God says people are going to see this and say, okay, she's pandering to black people, and of course it was meant as partly a joke. Hillary Clinton, though, pauses for a good couple of seconds before saying, okay, is it working? This attitude towards the black voting demographic, I think that a lot of us are finding very repulsive. And yet this is precisely one of the ways that the DNC seems to be moving forward in its attempt to get the office. In an article by Eric Levitz from New York Magazine, published March 2019, called "Will Black Voters Still Love Biden When They Remember This About Him?" What was the last part of that line? It's by the Intelligencer part of New York. Yeah, when they remember who he was. You can see that here. So Eric Levitz mentions, among other things, that the NAACP called Biden's proposal back in the day when he was senator an anti-black amendment. The Senate's sole African-American member, Ed Brooke, called it the greatest symbolic defeat for civil rights since 1964. So regardless of, we're not calling into question, is Biden a racist? Rather, what's important to note here is that any current motivations, it would seem, to get on board with this movement that has been propelled by organizations like Black Lives Matter seems to be a type of pandering more than a type of genuine concern, at least if we look at the levels of inconsistency that seem to be there with his prior politics. CBS News spoke with several black Democratic congresswomen who think that Biden should choose a black woman as his running mate because they say it's time for black women to serve in this top role after decades of loyalty to the Democratic Party. This is coming from an article by Timothy Perry called "Women of Color Are the Core, Biden Challenge to Pick a Black Woman as Running Mate," put out by CBS. So CBS News is basically saying here, without any denigration of it whatsoever, that Biden is giving consideration to these black women. Now, it seems to pose it as if those are the only people he's given consideration to, when in fact it looks like it's among others. He's definitely promised a woman, it would seem. I believe that consent was somewhere towards the bottom a little bit. So there's this is an issue for a lot of folks who are voting, because if you think about if you think of things through a more meritocratic lens, and I offer this example, when the Oscar was, and I can't remember the year, forgive me, but several years back, when we awarded the Oscar to the first black woman actress, black actress, Halle Berry for Monster Ball, there was quite a bit of backlash around that as well. It wasn't because Halle Berry was black or a woman, but because her performance was at best mediocre in Monster Ball, and that was pretty reasonably agreed with among everyone there. So why was she awarded that Oscar? And the idea is that this was a form of earlier virtue signaling that seemed to indicate that very strongly, and in a way that people were already aware of, but it had not been perhaps as blatant before, that the Oscars really is a political process of sorts. So the question is, do people deserve certain things, or better yet, do people receive certain positions or awards for their merit, for what they have earned, or is that earning just simply having waited for so long? A lot of us may be struggling with this idea that someone should be, I would love to see a black woman president, and I think a lot of us would. A black woman vice president would also be wonderful, but the idea that this is the sort of criterion we would pick is really difficult for some people to digest, that this is what we would pick over for their expertise and their professionalism over the actual qualities of a person, not their skin, that make them a good fit for the job. So you can read more about that. That was published in April. Again, earlier pieces are going to be coming from, they're going to be coming in earlier in the development of the candidacy, when Biden was still possibly not going to be the nominee. Now that he is, it's much harder to find things that are directly against him, and that's the common trend in all these elections. One more here. Joe Biden says he is considering 4 black women to be his running mate, is another article by Kate Sullivan, and I'm just going to briefly quote this. This was more recent, which is partly why I bring this one up as well. So we're getting closer and closer to that time when his picking is expected. So this was July 21st, just a few days ago. Kate Sullivan and Sarah Mucha, say Biden is considering a broad tier of candidates to be his running mate after pledging earlier this year to pick a woman for the job. So that was the piece I was wanting to refer to. Why definitely a woman? Again, it would be great to have a woman president and vice president, but are these the criteria that we want to use to determine who should be the proper candidate? We're not selecting based on leadership, then we're selecting based on race or sex. And this is what a lot of people are up in arms about, in addition to things like corruption. The other big thing that we want, last thing about Biden that we really want to think about, is the fact that he's a veteran politician. Even Vox, back in April, before, again, the nomination had been decided, I believe, they wrote an article called "Joe Biden is the Hillary Clinton of 2020. A more sober assessment would have begun with the observation that since the founding generation passed away, voters have tended not to want to put veteran politicians in the White House. With only a handful of exceptions, the voters choose to elevate an outsider who's going to fix the mess in Washington or drain the swamp, rather than an inside player who's mastered the system. So even Vox News, which is fairly liberal in its stance, sees that one of the potential downfalls to Biden is the fact that he's been doing this for so long, and that may not end up promoting his candidacy for people who are looking for change and something new. And as you can see already, this is part of why Unity 2020 addresses this. Both, we can say easily, are demonstrating corruption, DNC and GOP. To go back to Crystal Ball for a second, in a different video that you can find also on YouTube, called Crystal and Sagar react to new Biden corruption report back in January of this year. She says the fact that this is commonplace in D.C., which it is not an excuse. She's talking about the corruption that was a sort of underhanded deal here where that pertained to, let's just say, Biden's brother and the purchase of some land. She says the fact that this is commonplace is not an excuse because people are just done with it. They are done with the appearance of corruption. They're done with lawmakers who parlay their positions into cashing in on boards, or with healthcare companies in the financial industry, etc. Skipping forward a little bit. So the fact that this is standard operating procedure, which is essentially the Democratic position on all this, like nothing to see here, everybody does that. That's not an excuse. That's exactly why it is such a problem. So, she says, she continues, Democrats aren't going to touch this. No one's going to say anything about it. No one's going to say anything about any of it. But I can promise you, if he is the nominee, this will be a major point of discussion, and it will be a disaster because people are done with this kind of behavior. And look, Trump is just as bad, if not worse. In my view, he is worse and more blamed, but he's not running on making a moral case. Biden is running on his values. Let's restore the Biden values. Let's bring back his civility. Let's bring back his this good government. And this is really damaging when that's what you're basing your campaign on. And keep in mind, this was prior to the George Floyd incident and the anti-racist movement that's been coming out that has been aligning Biden with a lot of Black Lives Matter, the organization, a lot of their constituents and affiliations. All right, so we have covered a lot already on those two. One last article that I'll refer to before we move on. This was the longest of them and the one that I was bracing myself for the most is this part. It should be easy to see, if not by now, then with some further research, why people are getting very distraught about the candidates. This is not the first time in history. We had the same problem in 2016. We've had the same problem for many, many decades. So that is not itself the issue. The issue is how much longer do we tolerate it, and is it getting worse? So in an article by Big Think, How Unity2020 Plans to End the Two-Party System, Bring Back Andrew Yang. In this article by Stephen Johnson that came out just this month, he says Americans are rigidly divided on many issues, but the idea that national politics is corrupt is not one of them. In recent years, surveys on Americans' views on political corruption and their trust in the federal government reveal that cynicism stretches across both parties, even though diagnoses may differ. So, again, the overall impression here is corruption, and, importantly, that there's a sort of a pendulum swing, and we go from party to party, and even if one party gets a 2-year term like Obama, that essentially what we're doing is that pendulum is getting wilder and wilder, and more and more violent, and the question is whether or not our nation can handle that, especially when it's being upheld in that way by political corruption in the financial sectors of this institution.